They called him Pops. They laughed at his graying hair, his quiet demeanor, and the worn-out photo of his daughter he kept in his locker. To the arrogant young recruits, this 34-year-old single dad was a joke, a desperate man who didn't belong in their elite ranks. But when a grueling field test turned into a fight for survival, they learned a terrifying truth. He wasn't a rookie. And when the base general saw the tattoo hidden under his uniform, the mockery stopped forever. The air inside the Fort Benning Reception Battalion smelled of floor wax, nervous sweat, and cheap bleach. For most of the men standing on the yellow-painted footprints, this was the beginning of their lives. For 34-year-old Arthur Pendleton, it was a desperate return to a life he thought he had left behind in the dust of the Arghandab River Valley. Arthur didn't look like a soldier anymore. The years of civilian life, working double shifts at a lumberyard in Ohio, had thickened his waist slightly and dusted his dark hair with premature salt and pepper. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a heavy exhaustion that the 19-year-olds around him couldn't begin to fathom. He wasn't here for glory, and he certainly wasn't here to find himself. He was here because his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, had a rare neurological condition, and the civilian medical insurance he could afford barely covered her diagnostic scans. Re-enlistment meant TRICARE. It meant a fighting chance for his little girl.
"Hey, Pops, don't lock your knees. You might break a hip."
The voice belonged to Private First Class Jackson Jax Miller, a 20-year-old recruit who had spent the last 3 days ensuring everyone knew he was a high school wrestling champion and the son of a state senator. Jax was built like a cinder block, all broad shoulders and unearned confidence. He nudged his bunkmate, a lanky, eager-to-please kid named Tyler Vance, who snickered obediently. Arthur didn't turn his head. He stared straight ahead at the cinder block wall, his duffel bag resting at his boots. His silence only seemed to infuriate Jax further. "I'm talking to you, Grandpa," Jax hissed, leaning closer. "What are you doing here? Midlife crisis? Wife left you for a real man?" Arthur's jaw tightened, a microscopic shift that went unnoticed by the younger men. "Don't engage," he told himself, the mantra repeating in his mind like a metronome. "You're a slick-sleeved private on paper. Keep your head down. Do the time. Save Lily." The heavy steel doors banged open, and Drill Sergeant Marcus Thorne stepped into the room. The chaotic murmur of 80 nervous recruits vanished instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence. Thorne was a terrifying figure, a man carved out of mahogany and pure discipline, his campaign hat pulled low over razor-sharp eyes. He paced down the center aisle, his boots striking the linoleum with rhythmic precision.
"You are nothing!"
Thorne roared, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls.
"You are not civilians anymore, but you sure as hell aren't soldiers. You are raw material, and I am the grinder."
As Thorne moved down the line, evaluating the fresh meat, he paused in front of Arthur. The drill sergeant's eyes narrowed slightly, taking in the lines around Arthur's eyes, the quiet stillness of his posture. Unlike the trembling boys beside him, Arthur was perfectly balanced, breathing from his diaphragm, his eyes locked on a point 1,000 yards away.
"How old are you, recruit?"
Thorne barked, stopping mere inches from Arthur's face. 34, Drill Sergeant, Arthur replied, his voice calm, steady, devoid of the nervous tremor Thorne was accustomed to hearing. 34, Thorne repeated, turning to address the platoon. "We have a senior citizen in our midst. Tell me, Private, did you get lost on the way to the golf course?" A few stifled laughs rippled through the ranks. Jax's grin was wide and predatory. "No, Drill Sergeant," Arthur said evenly. Thorne studied him for a long moment. There was something in Arthur's eyes, a flat, unreadable emptiness that seasoned combat veterans recognized in each other. But Thorne brushed the thought aside. The Army had raised the enlistment age, bringing in all sorts of desperate civilians. "We'll see if your knees hold up in the mud, old man," Thorne sneered before moving on. That night, in the sterile, dimly lit barracks, Arthur sat on his bunk, carefully polishing his boots. The rhythmic motion was soothing. 2 bunks down, Jax and Tyler were holding court, bragging about the girls they left behind and how easy boot camp was going to be. "I'm telling you," Jax bragged loudly, throwing a sideways glance at Arthur. "They lower the standards so these old guys don't have heart attacks. It brings down the prestige of the whole unit. I'm gunning for airborne, maybe Rangers. Can't have grandpas holding my squad back." Arthur finished brushing the leather, setting the boot down quietly. He reached into his locker and pulled out a small laminated photograph. It was Lily, smiling brightly in a hospital bed, missing her 2 front teeth, her pale skin contrasting with a bright pink beanie. Arthur traced her face with a calloused thumb. The mockery, the physical pain to come, the absolute degradation of basic training, none of it mattered. The young men in this room were playing at war. Arthur had already lived in it. He tucked the photo away, closed his locker, and lay back on the thin mattress. The real test was yet to come, and Arthur knew exactly how to endure. The Georgian summer was unforgiving, a sweltering blanket of humidity that turned the red clay into a stifling oven. Week 3 of basic training was designed to break the recruits physically, to strip away their arrogance through sheer exhaustion. For Jax Miller, it was an opportunity to show off. For Arthur Pendleton, it was a test of pacing. It began with the Army Combat Fitness Test. As the sun crested the tree line, painting the sky in bruised purples and angry oranges, the platoon lined up for the deadlift. Jax loaded the hex bar with 340 pounds, the maximum weight. He gripped the metal, veins popping in his thick neck, and hoisted it up with a grunt of exertion, slamming it down triumphantly. "That's how it's done, boys!" Jax barked, high-fiving Tyler. When it was Arthur's turn, a quiet murmur spread through the squad. Arthur approached the bar. He didn't load the maximum. He set it to a respectable 200 pounds, enough to pass comfortably, but nowhere near the top score. He lifted it with perfect mechanical form, his face completely impassive, and stepped back. "Conserving your energy for the bingo tournament, Pops?" Jax taunted, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You're pathetic, barely passing." Arthur ignored him, moving on to the hand-release push-ups. He didn't try to beat Jax's explosive speed. He maintained a steady, unbroken rhythm, stopping exactly when he hit the maximum passing requirement. To the untrained eye of the young recruits, Arthur looked weak, unwilling to push himself. To Drill Sergeant Thorne, watching from the sidelines with a clipboard, it looked suspiciously like a man who knew exactly how much energy to burn to survive a long, brutal campaign. The bullying escalated during the 12-mile ruck march. Each soldier carried a 40-pound pack, their rifles slung across their chests. The route wound through dense mosquito-infested woods and steep, muddy inclines. Jax and Tyler started at a blistering pace, determined to finish first. Arthur settled into the middle of the pack, finding a rhythmic stride that ate up the miles without spiking his heart rate. By mile 8, the heat began to take its toll. The bravado faded, replaced by the ragged sound of heavy breathing and boots dragging in the gravel. Jax was still near the front, but his pace had slowed significantly. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Tyler was struggling badly, stumbling over roots, his rifle banging clumsily against his thighs. As they approached a particularly steep hill known infamously as the Anvil, Arthur steadily advanced, his pace entirely unchanged from mile 1. He was a machine, moving with an eerie, silent efficiency. As he passed Tyler, he noticed the young man's eyes rolling back slightly, the telltale signs of heat exhaustion setting in. "Drink water, Vance," Arthur said quietly, not breaking his stride. "Small sips. Don't dump it." Tyler blinked, looking dazed. Jax, overhearing the advice, fell back, shoving his way between them. "Back off, Grandpa. We don't need advice from a baseline pass. Keep walking." "He's dehydrating, Miller," Arthur said, his voice flat. "If he drops, your squad takes a penalty." "I said shut up," Jax snapped, shoving Arthur's shoulder. It was a mistake. Arthur didn't stumble. He didn't even shift his weight. He simply stopped, turning his pale blue eyes onto Jax. The temperature in the humid air seemed to plummet. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. Jax looked into Arthur's eyes and felt a sudden primal spike of terror, like a rabbit realizing it had just head-butted a wolf. The absolute stillness of the older man was horrifying. Drill Sergeant Thorne's voice cracked through the woods like a whip. "Is there a problem back there? Miller! Pendleton! Keep moving, or I'll have you low-crawling the rest of the way!" Arthur blinked, and the terrifying void in his eyes vanished, replaced by the weary look of the old man he pretended to be. He adjusted the straps of his ruck and resumed his march. Jack stood frozen for a second, his heart hammering against his ribs, unable to process what he had just seen. Shaking it off, Jax forced a sneer onto his face, grabbing Tyler by the harness and dragging him up the hill. They finished the march. Jax came in third. Arthur came in 12th, completely unbothered, barely out of breath, his uniform soaked in sweat, but his posture perfectly straight. As the platoon collapsed onto the grass, panting and groaning, Jax glared at Arthur. The fear he had felt on the trail curdled into a deep, toxic resentment. He couldn't stand the older man's calm. He couldn't stand the idea that this washed-up civilian might know something he didn't. Jax decided right then. Before basic training was over, he was going to break Arthur Pendleton. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the Fort Benning training grounds into a soupy, miserable swamp. Morale in the platoon was at rock bottom. Blisters popped and bled, muscles cramped, and sleep was a luxury doled out in 2-hour increments. It was 200 hours and Arthur was on fire watch. The barracks were silent save for the rhythmic snoring of exhausted men and the relentless drumming of rain against the window panes. Arthur walked the center aisle, his flashlight beam sweeping over the polished floor. His thoughts were 1,000 miles away, sitting by a hospital bed. He had used his 2 minutes of phone time earlier that day to call his mother-in-law. The news wasn't good. Lily was weaker, the doctors pushing for a new experimental treatment that the military insurance would cover, if Arthur officially graduated and secured his active duty status. Failure was not an option. He paused near his locker, noticing the door was slightly ajar. His brow furrowed. He always locked it. Always. He pulled the metal door open. His neatly folded shirts were tossed aside, his toiletries scattered, and there, sitting on the metal shelf, ripped neatly in half, was the laminated photograph of Lily. A cold, heavy silence descended upon Arthur. He didn't gasp. He didn't shout. He simply picked up the 2 halves of the photo, his hands terrifyingly steady. He carefully placed the pieces in his breast pocket, over his heart. He turned his head slowly, looking down the aisle. Jax and Tyler's bunks were 3 spaces down. Tyler was snoring softly, but Jax was awake. Arthur could see the faint glint of Jax's eyes in the shadows, watching him, waiting for an outburst, waiting for the old man to run to the drill sergeant and cry. Arthur didn't walk towards Jax. He didn't say a word. He finished his shift in absolute suffocating silence. The next morning, the tension in the platoon was palpable. Word had spread of the torn photo, though no one would admit who did it. Drill Sergeant Thorne sensed the toxic atmosphere immediately. He pushed them harder that day, running them through the obstacle course until they were vomiting in the mud. Through it all, Arthur remained a ghost. He spoke to no one. He performed every task with a mechanical, chilling precision. During hand-to-hand combat drills in the muddy pit, the pairings were announced. Thorne, reading the room, paired Jax and Arthur. "All right, ladies," Thorne shouted over the rain. "Pugil sticks. 3 points to win. No strikes to the groin, no strikes to the back of the neck. Go!" Jax stepped into the ring, spinning the heavy padded stick with a cocky grin. "Ready to get retired, Pops? Should have stayed home with the sick kid." The words barely left Jax's mouth before Arthur moved. It wasn't the clumsy, sweeping swing of a recruit. It was an explosive, kinetic burst of violence. Arthur didn't swing for the head. He stepped inside Jax's guard, jamming the butt of his pugil stick directly into Jax's solar plexus, stealing the breath from his lungs. As Jax doubled over, gasping, Arthur brought the heavy end of the stick down on the back of Jax's knee, collapsing his leg. Before Jax even hit the mud, Arthur's stick was pressed hard against his throat, pinning him to the ground. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. The surrounding recruits fell dead silent. Even Drill Sergeant Thorne blinked in shock. The mechanics of the takedown were flawlessly executed, completely outside the scope of the basic training curriculum. It was the movement of a man who had killed in close quarters. Arthur stared down into Jax's wide, terrified eyes. The young bully was struggling to breathe, the rain washing the mud from his panicked face. Arthur leaned in close, his voice a gravelly whisper that only Jax could hear. "You touch my things again, you breathe in the direction of my daughter, and I will show you what real war looks like, son. Nod if you understand." Jax nodded frantically, a pathetic squeak escaping his lips. Arthur instantly stepped back, dropping the pugil stick and returning to his neutral, exhausted posture. "Sorry, Drill Sergeant, slipped in the mud." Thorne stared at Arthur for a long, calculating moment. "Match to Pendleton. Next pair up." Jax crawled out of the pit, hacking up mud, his arrogance completely shattered. He looked back at Arthur, who was standing quietly at the edge of the circle, staring out into the rain. For the first time, Jax realized that the old man wasn't struggling to keep up with them. He was holding back, hiding a deeply buried monster beneath a facade of mediocrity. The culmination of basic training was a 48-hour continuous field training exercise known as the Crucible. It was designed to simulate the stress, sleep deprivation, and chaos of a combat deployment. The recruits were divided into squads, dropped into a heavily wooded training area, and tasked with navigating to various checkpoints, securing objectives, and repelling simulated ambushes using blank ammunition. Mother Nature decided to add her own twist to the exercise. A massive, unseasonable storm front rolled in off the coast, turning the sky a bruised purple and unleashing a torrential downpour that rapidly flooded the low-lying ravines of the training grounds. Arthur was assigned as a rifleman in Squad 3. Jax, eager to redeem his bruised ego and prove his leadership capabilities, had volunteered as the squad leader for Squad 4, with Tyler as his point man. By hour 36, the exercise had devolved into misery. Communications were spotty due to the storm, and the mud was knee-deep in places. Arthur's squad was huddled under a makeshift poncho hooch, checking their map. They had secured their final objective and were waiting for the extraction signal. Arthur sat quietly, chewing on a piece of dry MRE cracker, ignoring the cold rain seeping through his collar. He just wanted to get home. He just wanted to see Lily. Suddenly, the crackle of the squad radio broke the silence, cutting through the static. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Squad 4. Need immediate assistance." The voice was frantic, pitched high with genuine panic. It was Tyler. "Flash flood, we're trapped. Jackson is down. I repeat, Jackson is in the water." The Squad 3 leader, a young recruit named Davies, grabbed the radio. "Squad 4, what is your grid coordinate? The safety instructors called a halt 10 minutes ago. Didn't you get the transmission?" "Radio was down. Grid is..." Static washed over the channel, followed by a terrifying sound, the roar of rushing water and a scream. Arthur ripped the map from Davies' hands. He traced a finger along the contour lines, his eyes instantly calculating the topography. "They were heading for Checkpoint Delta," Arthur said, his voice slicing through the panic of the young recruits. "The quickest way there is through the Blackwood Ravine. With this rain, that ravine is a river right now. They walked right into a funnel." Davies looked terrified. "We have to wait for the drill sergeants. The instructors have safety boats." "The instructors are staged at base camp 4 miles away," Arthur said, already tightening the straps on his webbing. He grabbed his rifle and an extra coil of heavy rope from the squad's supply bag. "By the time they get here, Squad 4 will be drowned. Hold this position." Without waiting for an order, Arthur sprinted into the storm. He didn't run like a tired 34-year-old. He moved through the dense, darkened forest like a phantom, his boots finding solid ground where there seemed to be only mud. 10 minutes later, he reached the edge of the ravine. The sight was horrific. The normally dry gully was now a raging brown torrent of water, violently tossing uprooted trees and debris. Trapped on a small, rapidly shrinking outcropping of rock in the center of the rapids were 3 members of Squad 4, including Tyler. But it was Jax who was in the most immediate danger. He had tried to cross, lost his footing, and was now pinned against a large boulder by the rushing water, the heavy weight of his wet gear dragging him under. He was screaming, coughing up muddy water, his strength failing. Tyler and the others were paralyzed by fear, reaching out but too terrified to enter the rapids. Arthur didn't hesitate. He tied one end of the rope around a sturdy oak tree with a flawless bowline knot, wrapping the other end around his waist in a hasty harness. "Tyler!" Arthur roared over the deafening water. "Catch!" He threw the slack of the rope toward the outcropping. Tyler caught it clumsily. "Tie it around the rock! Do it now!" Once the line was taut, creating a makeshift bridge, Arthur unclipped his rifle and waded into the freezing, violent water. The current immediately tried to rip him away, the sheer force of it staggering. But Arthur moved with grim determination, hand over hand along the rope, ignoring the bruising impacts of submerged branches. He reached the boulder where Jax was pinned. Jax was barely conscious, his head slipping below the muddy surface. Arthur grabbed Jax by the collar of his tactical vest, his muscles screaming in protest. "Listen to me!" Arthur yelled inches from Jax's face. "You have to help me, son! Push off the rock!" Jax looked up, his eyes wild with panic. Seeing Arthur, the man he had tormented, the man whose daughter's photo he had torn, risking his life in the floodwaters, shattered whatever was left of Jax's pride. He nodded weakly and pushed. With a massive heave, utilizing leverage and a strength born of pure adrenaline, Arthur hauled Jax up over the boulder, freeing him from the current's trap. Wrapping his arms securely around the younger man, Arthur clipped a carabiner from Jax's vest onto the rope line. "Pull us in!" Arthur screamed to Tyler. Inch by agonizing inch, fighting the raging water, they dragged themselves back to the muddy shore. They collapsed in the mud, gasping for air, vomiting river water. Jax lay on his back, sobbing uncontrollably, his tough guy facade entirely washed away. Arthur sat up slowly. He checked Jax's pulse, checked his pupils. Finding him stable, Arthur stood up, his uniform torn, his shoulder throbbing with a deep, sharp pain where a log had struck him. He looked down at the shivering, terrified boys of Squad 4. "Get your gear," Arthur commanded, his voice returning to that chilling, calm baseline. "We're walking home." The aftermath of the storm was chaotic. When Arthur marched Squad 4 into the forward operating base, dragging a limping, humiliated Jax Miller, the base was in a state of high alert. Medics rushed forward with thermal blankets, and Drill Sergeant Thorne stormed through the mud, his face furious. "What in God's name happened out there?" Thorne demanded, glaring at Jax. "You were ordered to halt. You led your squad into a washout?" Jax, wrapped in a foil blanket, couldn't look Thorne in the eye. The fear of failure, the fear of his politician father's wrath, briefly overpowered his recent humbling. He stammered, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur. He panicked, Drill Sergeant. Pendleton abandoned his squad. We had to go in after him. I slipped trying to pull him out." Tyler Vance whipped his head around, staring at Jax in absolute disbelief. "Jax, what are you doing?" Tyler whispered frantically. "Shut up, Vance," Jax hissed. Thorne turned his terrifying gaze to Arthur. Arthur stood perfectly at attention, completely drenched, a deep gash on his cheek bleeding sluggishly. He didn't defend himself. He didn't call Jax a liar. He maintained his silence. Before Thorne could unleash his fury, a sudden commotion at the command tent silenced the entire camp. A convoy of black SUVs, muddy but imposing, had pulled up. Surrounded by anxious base commanders, a tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out into the mud. He wore the 3 silver stars of a lieutenant general on his patrol cap. It was General Harlan Reeves, the commander of the Regional Training Doctrine, known for his legendary temper and his immaculate combat record. He was doing a surprise inspection of the base's crisis response during the storm. General Reeves took one look at the huddled, shivering recruits and the angry drill sergeant. He marched directly toward them, his boots splashing heavily in the puddles. The entire area snapped to rigid attention, saluting sharply. "At ease," Reeves barked. "I heard a medevac call over the radio. Who went into the water?" Thorne stepped forward. "General, sir, Squad 4 got caught in the Blackwood washout. Private Miller here claims he was attempting to rescue Private Pendleton, who had broken formation." General Reeves looked at Jax. The young man swallowed hard, terrified by the intense scrutiny of the 3-star general. Reeves then looked at Arthur. Arthur's face was smeared with mud, his uniform torn. He stood staring straight ahead, perfectly still. "Is this true, Private?" Reeves asked Arthur, his voice surprisingly quiet. "Did you break formation and require a rescue by your squad leader?" Arthur didn't blink. "I was in the water, sir, that is true." Tyler Vance couldn't take it anymore. The guilt of his silence burned in his chest. "That's a lie, sir," Tyler yelled, breaking rank. "I'm sorry, Drill Sergeant, but it's a lie. Jax led us into the ravine. We got trapped. Pendleton wasn't even in our squad. He came from a mile away and pulled Jax out of the river. He saved our lives. Jax is lying to save his own skin." A deadly silence fell over the camp. Jax turned white as a sheet, staring at the mud. Thorne looked like he was going to explode, but General Reeves held up a hand. The general stepped closer to Arthur, scrutinizing the older recruit. There was something about Arthur's posture, the way he carried the physical pain of the rescue without a flinch, that struck a chord in Reeves's memory. "You're bleeding, Private," Reeves noted, gesturing to Arthur's shoulder, where the fabric of his uniform was torn open, revealing bruised, lacerated skin underneath. "Medic, get over here and look at this man's shoulder." A base medic sprinted over, opening a trauma kit. "I need to cut the shirt, sir, to check for a collarbone fracture," the medic said. "Do it," Reeves ordered. The medic took trauma shears and sliced the wet fabric of Arthur's uniform top, peeling it back over his left shoulder. As the muddy, soaked fabric fell away, it exposed Arthur's left bicep and shoulder. The medic paused, his eyes widening. Drill Sergeant Thorne stepped closer, confused. But it was General Harlan Reeves who reacted the most viscerally. The blood completely drained from the general's face. He took a stumbling half-step backward, his eyes locked onto the black ink scarred into Arthur's flesh. It was a tattoo, but not a standard military skull or eagle. It was a perfectly rendered image of a cracked Spartan shield, heavily shadowed by an eclipsed black sun. Beneath it, a single string of Roman numerals was etched into the skin. Reeves knew that tattoo. He knew it because there were only 12 men in the entire history of the United States Armed Forces who had ever earned the right to wear it. It was the insignia of Task Force Echo, a deeply classified Tier 1 strike team that officially did not exist. 6 years ago, in a catastrophic ambush in a nameless Afghan valley, Task Force Echo had sacrificed themselves to hold a mountain pass, allowing a pinned-down infantry battalion, commanded by a then-Colonel Harlan Reeves, to escape total annihilation. Reeves had watched the valley burn. He had been told there were no survivors. The general's voice trembled slightly as he stared at the ink. "What is your name, recruit?" Arthur finally looked the general in the eye. "Pendleton, sir. Arthur Pendleton." Reeves swallowed heavily, the memories of gunfire and screaming radios flooding his mind. "I read the casualty reports, Pendleton. I signed the commendations. You were listed as KIA." "I was in a black site hospital in Germany for 14 months, sir," Arthur replied quietly. "When I woke up, the unit was gone. I took my discharge. I went home." Jax and Tyler stared in utter bewilderment. Drill Sergeant Thorne's jaw clenched tightly as the realization hit him. The absolute discipline, the terrifying takedown in the mud pit, the silent endurance. It all made sense now. He hadn't been screaming at a recruit. He had been screaming at a ghost, one of the most lethal operators the country had ever produced. "Why are you here, Sergeant?" General Reeves asked, unconsciously using Arthur's true rank. "A man with your record? You don't belong in basic training." Arthur's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of the last 3 weeks finally showing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the 2 torn halves of Lily's photograph, holding them together in his palm. "My daughter is sick, sir. I needed the medical coverage. The recruiter said my break in service was too long. My records were sealed. They made me start over. I just need to graduate, General. I just need to take care of my little girl." The silence that followed Arthur's words was heavy, pregnant with the gravity of his sacrifice. General Reeves stared at the torn photo of the little girl, then slowly raised his eyes to the exhausted face of the man who had quite literally walked through hell for him years ago, only to be forced to crawl through the mud for a medical plan today. Reeves turned slowly toward Jax Miller. The fury in the general's eyes was absolute, a cold, terrifying wrath that made the young bully shrink back in terror. "You tore that photograph, Private Miller?" Reeves asked, his voice dangerously low. Jax was trembling so violently he could barely speak. You mocked a man who bled for this country before you even knew how to shave," Reeves roared, his voice echoing across the fob. "You cowardly, lying piece of garbage. You tried to frame a man who just saved your pathetic life, a man whose boots you are not fit to shine. Drill Sergeant Thorne." "Yes, General!" Thorne shouted, snapping to attention. "Process Private Miller for an immediate dishonorable discharge," Reeves ordered, his voice echoing like thunder. "Falsifying a report, cowardice in the field, and conduct unbecoming. Get him out of my sight. Now!" Jax broke down completely, weeping as 2 military police officers stepped forward, stripping him of his gear and dragging him away. The arrogant bully who had terrorized the platoon was gone, replaced by a broken boy facing the ruin of his future. Tyler Vance watched him go, a mixture of pity and intense relief washing over him. Tyler looked at Arthur, nodding deeply in a silent gesture of absolute respect and apology. General Reeves turned back to Arthur. The anger melted from the general's face, replaced by a profound, deferential respect. He extended his hand. Arthur looked at it for a moment before gripping it firmly. "Your records will be unsealed and reinstated by midnight tonight, Sergeant First Class Pendleton," Reeves said, his voice loud enough for the entire camp to hear. "You will receive your full back pay, your combat decorations, and immediate top-tier medical clearance for your daughter. You are done with basic training. You're coming with me to command." Arthur felt a sudden, overwhelming tightness in his chest. The stoic mask he had worn for weeks finally cracked. His eyes filled with unshed tears as he looked down at the torn photo of Lily. The nightmare was over. She was going to be okay. "Thank you, sir," Arthur choked out, his voice thick with emotion. Reeves stepped back and snapped a perfect, crisp salute to the enlisted man. It was an incredibly rare gesture of respect, a general saluting a subordinate first. Instantly, Drill Sergeant Thorne followed suit, saluting Arthur. Then, Tyler Vance raised his hand. Within seconds, every single recruit, medic, and officer in the muddy camp was standing at rigid attention, rendering a silent, awestruck salute to the old man they had mocked. Arthur stood tall, the mud and blood on his uniform suddenly looking more like medals of honor. He returned the salute, the shadow of the eclipsed sun tattoo stark against his skin. He was no longer Pops, he was no longer a joke. He was a father, a survivor, and a warrior who had finally come home.